Hello and welcome to the Cardiac Cats YouTube channel. I'm your host, Jacob Shorba, and today we're going to be talking about some of the biggest needs for the Jaguars during the 2024 NFL offseason. So we're going to go through really about every position on the roster during this video. Going to break down the players that are currently there, who we expect to be there, who we might not. This will kind of feed off of our prediction series and what we've heard so far. So there is some projection involved, but I think it's still kind of it's the same regardless, right? Because if there's players you don't know whether they're going to be here this offseason or not, for a lot of those guys, they're probably not your long-term solutions, unless we're talking about, maybe Calvin Ridley. Because if Calvin Ridley comes back, well, obviously, you feel pretty good about wide receiver then. You just want to see what's going on with Zay Jones or if there's a replacement there. But, we'll get into all that for sure. But we're going to start off by talking about the strengths of this team. And so I've got 6 positions listed here. I'll throw in a 7th as well because I realized I didn't really hit special teams when I was making all the graphics here. But I think when you look at this team, there's 6 spots that I feel really good about. One is quarterback, which we obviously, in our last video, talked about quarterback a lot, talked about Trevor Lawrence. Regardless of whether or not you think he's the guy, you think he's better than people think, or you think he's worse, whatever it is, he's going to be the quarterback the next 2 seasons. The only thing you're looking at quarterback is potentially a new backup, which I don't think the team's really going to look at that closely. It would just be more so of something that I would consider if you had a really good value there in the draft, which, like, say Michael Pratt is there on day 3 at some point. Say that somehow Spencer Rattler might be. You might look around and try to get a better backup just in case things go south, because you did see a lot of teams that were able to really pull it out of the gutter when it seemed like their seasons were over. I apologize, by the way, for that ring notification. Got that silenced now. But quarterback, obviously going to be a strength on the team right now. You also talk about running back. Obviously, Travis Etienne, fantastic season. Tank Bigsby, not as much. But my thing with Tank Bigsby, I'm not going to say that he was worth the 88th overall pick. But what I will say is for what they wanted him to do, they didn't really give him a chance his first year. They wanted him to run between the tackles. They had a terrible offensive line to do it. And so you're basically setting a rookie into a death sentence. And so I think you've clearly got to give him another shot. And even if he doesn't get a ton of snaps, Dearness Johnson is, I think, a pretty good backup to have. And we'll see if he comes back. But I feel good enough at running back to where we're not really looking at that unless you have a very extreme situation with maybe a best player available that just should not even be there. Kind of like we talked about with quarterback for a backup. Now, as far as the air positions here, SWR stands for slot receiver. Anytime I put an S in front of those, that's usually what it means. So Christian Kirk is obviously the starter there. One of the best in the league. You're not going to have much of a conversation. But even with the backup, you have Parker Washington, who I think did really good filling in last year. He's only going to improve as a player. I feel really good about that spot. So we're not really looking at slots. You look at tight end, you have Evan Ingram, right? In the most receptions in the NFL last year, nearly broke the record for all of NFL history. I think he definitely broke Jacksonville's record. So clearly had a great year. He's a good player. And so you've got him. You've got your backups as well. Brendan Strange was a second-round pick. I don't support him having been a second-round pick, but you're not making changes there. You're only taking that if there's an extreme value available. And then left tackle and safety are the last 2. It's a left tackle. I kind of hint at it in the picture here. I am basically projecting Anton Harrison as the left tackle. I think that's very likely. And something to go along with that, I think, kind of confirms the idea for you guys. And I'll probably put out a short later today if I can. Or actually, this will be the day before for you guys. I'm recording this one day in advance. The Jaguars were looking at Micah Onwenu in free agency. I probably said that wrong. But he's one of the Patriots players. He's a guard / tackle. He's played on the right side his whole career. If they're looking at him as a possible signing, which he is a starter, he's going to be $15 million, something like that a year, right? You're putting him out on the field. If you're putting him at right guard, Brandon Scherf's gone. If you're putting him at right tackle, which is more likely, Cam Robinson's gone. because you're not benching Anton Harrison, you're not moving him to guard, you're not doing anything like that. So it seems pretty clear that Jacksonville is going to overhaul some things on the offensive line. It'll probably be both Cam Robinson and Brandon Scherf. So in that scenario, I mean, Balky even said himself he thinks Anton can play left tackle. I don't think he would have answered that question if he didn't really want to open up that can of worms, if it wasn't something they were really looking at. I think that's what's going to happen. I think they believe in him. It's their bright spot from last year. I think Balky really wants to emphasize how good of a pick that is, too, for the sake of his own job. And in addition, I do think this is the right thing to do anyway. So Anton's probably going to be the left tackle. You're going to feel really good about that. It's a strength. Had a really good rookie year later down in the season, so love that. And then safety, you have Andre Sisco at free safety. Your strong safety right now is Rayshon Jenkins. I think he gets cut realistically. I think Antonio Johnson ends up being the strong safety next year. Because you got to remember, when Jacksonville drafted him, there were a lot of questions about him because he was kind of the one clear hit on the third day of the draft. And so the media was asking a lot about him and kind of hitting at that. And they asked him, do you look at him as a nickel or do you look at him as a safety? And so I think it was Balky or Peterson, one of the two, said that they look at him as a safety. They don't look at him as a slot. I remember that because it upset some people because we thought, man, this is like the perfect starter in the slot this year. So I think that's the way they see him. He did really well while he was on the field this year. Very limited amount of time, but still somehow had 2 interceptions. He was an impact player when he was on the field. I don't know if that's necessarily going to be that way immediately when he starts, but I think he's definitely earned a starting position. And so you feel really good about that because you like what Sisco can do. And Antonio Johnson has a ton of upside, really good value pick. I think he's a starter in the NFL. You're set at safety. You don't need investments, especially when Andrew Wingard is your backup there. So there's my rant on the strengths. Now we're going to talk about positions of need. And I've got 8 we're going to go through. Actually, throw in really quick. Special teams, just a note on that. Punter would be another strength I'd throw on this list. I just didn't add special teams. And kicker would be a position of need as well. We'll see how they address that. They brought back Riley Patterson on a futures deal. I think they could definitely look to draft someone potentially this offseason. Could even look at a free agent signing. So that'll be a position they look at. But this is going to be focused primarily on offense and defense. So let's get into the first weakness. So we're going to go from probably the least important to the most important as we go through this. So the first one's going to be linebacker. And I haven't noted at the bottom the ways that I would be considering adding to this position group. So we could talk about free agency, we could talk about the draft, and then what kind of priority does it have in the draft? And so I think for linebacker, this is a position they've invested tons of resources in recently, right? But even with that, if you don't hit on the picks, it doesn't matter. You can't just say, okay, well, we spent, and this is essentially what it was when you consider what the trades cost. We spent a second, a third, 2 fourths, and a 6th round pick investing into what was 3 linebackers. You have Devin Lloyd, Chad Muma, and Ventrell Miller. Out of those 3, you have 1 starter. And maybe 2. If the best case scenario runs out with Chad Muma. And you have to consider that this team is going to run multiple fronts this year. They're going to run more of these 4-3 looks, so you're going to have these 3 guys out on the field. So you have to make sure you're ready. And then you also got to consider that Foye Oluokun has 1 year left on his deal. I think he would be a good extension candidate after the draft just because you want to make sure you don't extend him and then you just have some incredible linebacker sitting there in the draft and you can't pick him because of that. So that kind of inhibits it. But Oluokun is also potentially going to be a lot more expensive when you extend him because he's very much earned a bigger contract. So you have to be at least considering these things as options when there's a scenario that plays out that would be to your benefit. And so I think that's possible at linebacker because, for example, I put this out on the Twitter if you follow me at all on there. What if Edgerrin Cooper's on the board, say in the 2nd round? I don't know how you guys view him, but say that he is clearly a late 1st round prospect, early day 2 prospect, and he's your best guy on the board. Do you pick him? Because I think you do if he's clearly the best player on the board because Muma doesn't stop you. So it's got to be at least considered as a weakness. Now, you'd prefer other positions were there, right? Because it's disgusting to think we would spend this many resources on one position. But it still matters that you eventually have the starters, you eventually have a good enough group. And that's something they're going to have to consider this offseason with how poorly the team has done investing at that position outside of free agency. So those are my thoughts on linebacker. Now we'll get to our next group. And this one, I've got it seventh right now. It could go up to second really fast depending on what happens. But I've got cornerback as a need for this team. I think right now, pretty clearly, you don't have a backup at the position that you really trust. I think that Monteric Brown did pretty well when he came in. I applaud him for that. He played very admirably this last year, had the game-winning play against the Saints. That was awesome to see. But that's still not good enough to where you're not going to consider getting a backup, especially when you consider that Darius Williams is 31. He's got one more year left on his deal. This is the age where people start to fall off at cornerback. I hope for his sake he doesn't, but just historical trends. And then Tyson Campbell, this is the final year of his rookie deal. You got to earn the contract now. I mean, we're not going to be paying him a couple million next year, or after 2024, that is. So you don't know the future right now for this position. And so you absolutely have to consider it if someone really good is on the board. I mean, what if like a Nate Wiggins is sitting there in the first round? I think he's probably going to be the best player on the board if he's there. I think I have him at like 10th or 11th on my big board. So I think you absolutely have to consider it, but it could shoot up even more depending on what happens this offseason, because I think that there's the possibility that Darius Williams could be traded. And it would hurt. He's one of my favorite players on this team. I'm torn about how I feel about that because I do think the pick you'd get for him is very good, but I want him in Jacksonville. This is a guy who came here because he wanted to be in Jacksonville. He's a native to here. He took a pay cut to come down here. It just doesn't feel right, but you have to make the right decisions for the organization. And with a switch to more man coverage and all that, even if there's a bit of zone involved, you have to reevaluate this. And so I think realistically what happens is that maybe if they get a really good cornerback in the draft, then they would move off Darius Williams. I don't think he gets traded anytime soon. I think it would be after the draft if it happens. And then, if you don't get a guy that you feel really good about starting on the boundary, then you're not going to worry about moving on from Williams. You're going to keep him this year and see what happens. Maybe you give him a 1-year extension too. That's another option. But cornerback's a sneaky one because we don't really know where this is going to fall right now. But with what I would expect to happen, which we really don't know, I think it is one of the lesser needs on this team, but one you absolutely consider because next offseason, this might be the biggest need on the team. So those are my thoughts there. Now we'll move to our sixth position group here, and that's defensive end and outside linebacker. And so I have this position group being one that you address in free agency and also in those BPA scenarios, so best player on the board that's available. I think you clearly have your starters at outside linebacker, right? In your 3-4 looks, it's a little more questionable with your defensive ends because right now you have, Roy Robertson Harris, and then you have Yasir Abdullah, which probably isn't a great option there. I mean, he's undersized right now. He didn't do a whole lot his first year. There's a ton of projection with him to be a really good player for this team. So there's clearly a need behind these guys because you can't play them on 100% of the snaps, and you need to load up the defensive line. And so I think they need to look in free agency at some bargains, some players that could clearly outperform contracts. The one that stands out to me the most, and you will probably hear about him when we do our predictions on free agency, it's going to be Marcus Davenport. He played for 5 years in New Orleans, played with Ryan Nielsen, who was a defensive line coach, two people that know each other very well. When Ryan Nielsen left New Orleans to go to Atlanta, that was the same year that Marcus Davenport went up to Minnesota, signed a 1-year, $13 million deal, ended up getting hurt really early in the year. Didn't get to prove anything. Now they have him projected at like $5 million. So with Marcus Davenport being someone who's more of a defensive lineman than like a drop into coverage outside linebacker, that's a really good bargain. And so I think you're looking at free agency at guys like that makes sense for this team. I mean, heck, you could even consider a Calais Campbell if you want to. I know we talked about him a ton last season. We won't talk about him a ton this time. But that would actually make sense. So free agency makes a lot of sense because you do want to get contributors. But in the draft, you also consider it because you might have a really good bargain available there. You might have a player who should not be available on the board. And depending on how they see these prospects, I mean, there's like 3 or 4 guys that you could try to argue are worth more than the 17th overall pick in this draft. So those being Dallas Turner, Leatu Latu, Jared Verse. I know this one sounds crazy, but by April, I don't think it will be. Darius Robinson. That's one that people are talking about maybe being able to sneak into the top 10 by the end of the cycle, which is crazy. It is absolutely crazy. I'm not saying that's completely normal, but that's the way these teams work. And you look at like some of the measurables with him. I mean, his wingspan is literally larger than Trayvon Walker's. So teams are going to convince themselves of these kinds of things, especially when Trayvon Walker actually worked out as a draft pick. So you got to consider it in the draft if there's a really good player there, he's the top of your board, right? I don't know if that'll be the case, but it's something you're definitely looking at as you go through. You're not crossing it off. You're still considering those prospects. So those are my thoughts there. We're going to go to the offensive line now. And we're going to talk about tackle, specifically right tackle. Because I think the way that things are going to be set right now, you have Anton going to left. Cam Robinson, I think, is going to get cut. I think the Jaguars will consider re-signing him to be the right tackle, but I think he goes somewhere else. I think someone else values him enough to pay him just a little more than what Jacksonville can. Now, I didn't write free agency on here, although I think the Jaguars could look to solve the problem in free agency. And the reason why I did that is because a lot of the time, free agency tackles, even if you think they're the best ones, just don't work out like you think they will. I think like the one example I can think of that went really well was probably Trent Williams, and that might have even been a trade, to be fair. And it's Trent Williams. He's one of the best players to ever do it. So right tackle, this is a position that if Little has to start, you can survive with that, and maybe he has a good final year. It is a contract year. He's got to show up. And if you give him a whole offseason and tell him, hey, you actually have a starting spot on the team now, you don't got to worry about being replaced the second Cam comes back from injury or comes back from suspension or whatever it is, maybe Walker Little will be more ready. Maybe he'll play well. But that doesn't eliminate the idea of hitting a right tackle in the draft. So if you have a really good opportunity to take one, you're considering it. You look at guys like maybe Christian Jones, like early day 3 or late day 2. Guy with a ton of snaps at right tackle. He is 24. He is an older prospect, but he's pretty refined by now. He's got great size. Like, you look at prospects like that, and you're not really being stopped from drafting those because you have Walker Little in his final year of his rookie contract. So that's what I mean here. Where I would look at it in the draft, I think they might do it in free agency. It sounds like that's very possible. But the draft would be something I would be looking at this position, considering it throughout. So those are my thoughts on right tackle. Now let's get to wide receiver. And this might not even be on the list in a couple weeks. We'll see. But you've got Calvin Ridley right now who's going to be a free agent. He's going to hit the market. There's no way around that unless they decide to get a deal done before, give up a second, which isn't going to happen, or they franchise tag him, which isn't going to happen. So if that's the case, there's very much a chance that Calvin Ridley walks. And what we understand right now, and I think the report came out from John Shipley, hope I'm crediting the right person, but he was talking about how he believes that the Jaguars are currently trying to negotiate the framework of a contract with Calvin Ridley because he is on the team right now. You can talk to him. You can negotiate. It's not tampering or anything like that. You have something in place. If he hits free agency, if someone offers him way more, sure, he'll go there, but if he's not getting those offers, he's going to come right back to Jacksonville. And I think it's very much possible now that that could end up happening, and you might not even have a need at receiver, especially if the Jaguars just say, look, we're going to keep Zay Jones. We think he's going to be what he was before. Okay, I mean, you could survive without hitting the position. But I do think past this season that you do have a need there. Because even if Calvin Ridley ends up signing a long-term deal, I don't think Zay Jones is a long-term answer. So you're still considering it. And so I would be looking at free agency if you have either Zay Jones get cut or Calvin Ridley ends up signing with another team. You could also classify Calvin Ridley as a free agent signing anyway. But then I'd also be looking at the draft. So I'd be watching top 3 prospects for one. I'd be watching if maybe one of them falls. So we're talking about Marvin Harrison Jr., we're talking about Malik Neighbors, we're talking about Rome Odunze. The top of the draft is stacked. And there's some defensive players that are challenging right now to be considered in the mix at the very top. So it's possible that you might have a really good player fall down the board, where Jacksonville could move up for that player. They might also like a guy like Brian Thomas Jr. They could draft a guy later on like a Javon Baker. There's a lot of different ways to address it, but I do think that's a position that even if everyone comes back, you would very much like to address it because the team needs to develop. They cannot just they cannot just pay 3 players at wide receiver and think that's fine. Because it's an incredibly expensive way to run things, especially when last year you didn't get the impact you wanted to. So we'll see what happens. I think at the very least you're looking for the Zay Jones replacement long term. I would personally cut him. If that happens, I think the top guy in free agency you look at is probably Kendrick Bourne. Now, obviously, that's behind Calvin Ridley. You want Calvin Ridley back first and foremost. But Kendrick Bourne would be a logical one because it's someone they tried trading for before. And I think just listening to interviews, things I hear about him, the way he plays, feels like a pretty good fit here. Feels like a guy who'd fit into the locker room. So I think wide receiver is going to have a change. I think it has to. I've heard some stuff about Jacksonville maybe being interested in that. So let's hope that happens. You know, regardless of what happens with Zay Jones, Calvin Ridley, they need to prepare for the future at that position. So let's get into our last 3 spots here. And these are some more of these must-address positions, ones you have to hit. I think slot cornerback is the first one I'd list. And so I'll reiterate it once again for you guys. Antonio Johnson is going to be considered as a safety by the Jaguars, unless they have some huge change of mind, huge change of philosophy here. That's what they've said he is. They believe he's a safety. So I'm not putting him in this mix. And the way that leaves it, you have Trey Herndon, who nearly walked last year. I think he does this year because I think the Jaguars want to upgrade there. I don't think they're as afraid to make some changes now. And Trey Herndon is going to get paid well by another team. I'm not saying $10 million or anything like that, but I think he's going to get paid $3-4 million, most he's made in his career. He's a solid starter. But the Jaguars can do better than that. I think that's what they're going to try to do. And so you got Gregory Jr., you got Christian Braswell. Gregory Jr. had a really good preseason this year, but that doesn't really earn you the spot to the point where the team's like, oh, sorry, we can't take a slot corner. You see this guy last year? He was great in preseason. Just can't consider it. That's not going to happen. Even if Gregory Jr. would end up being a solid starter, he just hasn't really got to prove it, hasn't got the snaps, hasn't earned them, whatever it is. You know, and I think he's done fine for the selection that he was. But you're going to consider getting a replacement. I wouldn't look at free agency too close here because I don't think the value is really there. I think you've got to pay a little too much, and I want to reset the cap where we can. I don't want to solve every problem through free agency, but I want to set up free agency to where when I enter the draft, I don't have to be pigeonholed into certain positions. You know, so you want to try to balance that approach. And so I don't think the value is really there in free agency. And you look at the draft, it's a really deep draft class. I mean, just at most positions, especially the ones that the Jaguars need. I think like slot cornerback, you look at maybe Jarvis Brownlee Jr. as a guy. You could look at later prospects like a Chow Smith-Wade, maybe even a Mike Sainer still. So there's lots of options, way more than I just listed. I think they can hit that in the draft, and I think they need to hit that in the draft. And so it's a position you might trade up for, you might trade down for, get in a position to where you're comfortable taking a player that you have ranked highly at the position and is one of your top prospects on the board. So I think they can definitely do that. But the draft would definitely be the way I'd go there. And it's the same with defensive tackle. I know that right now there are a lot of defensive tackles getting projected to hit the market, but it is going to cost a lot of money. And I mean a lot of money. So we're talking about $20 million plus for this position. So you're going to have salary cap issues if you're going that route. I think that's the main problem I have with it. You also have to consider Devon Hamilton had some off the field issues with his injury, with his back. Terrible stuff. I'm hoping the best for him. I think he is going to come back better. So that does help out a lot at that position. We're quite frankly thankful that we even have him on the field because he didn't even know if he was going to play football again. So that's something that's going to be there, right? But you need to add someone else in the mix because the Jaguars weren't able to stop the run and they couldn't rush the passer from the inside. So something's got to happen. But here's the good thing. Once again, there is a ton of depth in this draft at the positions that you need. There are a ton of defensive tackles that you could consider. You could get a defensive tackle that could be a solid starter early on day 3. So there's a lot of options out there. Plenty of opportunities for this team. That's a position I would be looking very close at. But I think you hit it in the draft, and that's your best approach because this is a position I just don't want to be paying players after the rookie deals unless they are the best of the best. I mean, it's similar to tackle, where like you don't want to be in the situation where you're paying Cam Robinson 17, 18 million a year, who's like a little bit above average, but then Trent Williams and all these other guys are earning maybe 5, 6 million more, but they're shut down. They're the best of the best. The value is just not really there for that. And so you want to be careful about spending at a position like defensive tackle, because if you're going to pay that kind of money, you need to get the absolute best of the best. And you may believe that one of these players is that, and if they are, might be a good investment. I would rather take my opportunity in the draft to address this position. So clearly a need, though. Fadakasi is going to be out the door. Hamilton, you hope he gets better this year. I do think he will. And then Adam Gotsis, not really a player that factors in too much into the picture here. So those are my thoughts on that position. We'll finish this off with the final one. And the biggest one, and one we mentioned even last offseason, that the team just quite frankly ignored. And that's the interior of the offensive line. Not only was this the weakest unit on the team last year, but it is probably going to be the most barren heading into free agency. Because I think you see some guys walk. I think Brandon Scherf ends up getting cut. I think Ezra Cleveland, as much as I liked him coming in, and I think he will be a better player in the future, I'm not completely sold that the Jaguars would be willing to buy into that. Because then their team's going to look at his work volume from the first 3 years and the beginning of his 4th year. And they're going to say this is a really good player because that's what he was. For Jacksonville, their experience with him was the worst he's played. So it's hard for me to convince myself he's going to come back here unless he just says, you know what, I want to be in Jacksonville. I will take a deal with you guys 1 year. I'm going to prove that I'm worth it. So I don't think that happens. And if that's the case, going through the entire roster of who I think would be on this team, there's 2 guys on the interior. One is Fortner, Luke Fortner, who gets destroyed every time he touches a field. And then you got Cooper Hodges, who I think it's possible he could be a starter. There's some exciting tape on him from college, but he hasn't taken a regular season snap. You can't just hand the job away to a 7th round pick like that. You have to be smart about it. And at the very least, you need depth there. So all 3 positions probably need something. And you can't just go fix that in free agency unless you want to really open up the wallet. And you can't go fix that in the draft unless you just want to ignore every other position. So I think you need to do it in both. This is a problem that has to be addressed. You cannot ignore it. If they do a half-assed job, if they don't fix the whole problem, we're going to be right back where we were before, because this team will not be able to run the ball again. They won't be able to throw down the field again because they'll be getting sacked 2 seconds after the play starts. That's a problem. And that's why your quarterback struggled last year. And he's got his own problems too, but that is a huge factor in this, was the offensive line. And I think even, as much as people don't like Press Taylor, I think it impacted the way he was able to call things. Because what can you do when your offensive line can't block for you? So the interior needs tons of work. I think you've got to go out in free agency and at least address 2 of these positions. Players that I'm looking at really close, I think you have Damian Lewis as one, left guard from Seattle. I think he'd be a really good addition. Also a more physical player, but someone who's young, someone who is ascending, who is getting better in the NFL. I think at center, there could be a really good opportunity with like a Connor Williams, where he outplayed his last contract. He was paid $7 million a year, but he tore his ACL. And I think he'll come back and he'll be okay, but that risk gets built into the contract. It's going to be more affordable. He is one of the best centers in the NFL. So I think that's the kind of player you take that risk on, even if he has an injury. So I think you go out, you try to get 2 guys like that, you go into the draft, and at some point, the value is going to be there at that position because it is a very deep class on the offensive line. And you also have a ton of tackle prospects that could be converts to guard in the NFL. So there's a lot of options out there for the Jaguars to address this, and that's a really good thing. We just have to hope that the team can acknowledge this is an issue and do what is necessary to fix the problem, even if it requires admitting maybe we made the wrong draft pick, because it's what they're going to have to do with Luke Fortner. So those are my thoughts, guys. I've got 8 positions of need for the Jaguars. I think it's a lot to address, but the good news is that this is a great offseason to do it. You have so much talent in the draft, specifically where they need it. In the free agency class, I think you've got some really obvious bargain deals for this team that could be impact players. Could be players that absolutely outperform their contracts. So we have a really good opportunity to do this. But either way or not, guys, the good news, I hope, is that they either get things figured out or Trent Baalke goes bye-bye. I just hope it's one of those 2 things. Obviously, I'd prefer to win, but I could live with either. We'll see what they do. But that's all I've got for this video. We're going to have more videos coming out over the next few days. Should have 3 more each day here for a little bit, and then we'll get into the Combine this next week. So a lot coming up on here. If you guys stuff you want to see on this channel, let me know. Definitely willing to listen to what your guys' input is on content, what we talk about, all that. But this is all I got for you today. So thank you for watching. Hope you have a great day. And finally, go Jags.